Welcome. Wonderful to have you all here. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Ilse Hampton. I'm the CEO of Meaningful Aging Australia. And it's really fantastic to see the amount of interest we've had today in our special webinar on identity. Welcome also to my colleagues working from home. So we've got Monique, she's up in Sydney, brand new staff member. Welcome, Monique, great to see you. And Lily, who's also a brand new staff member in our administration role in lockdown in Melbourne, but we're all fine because we know what to do. We've done this before. And Dr Raelene Wilding, who's of course presenting this morning. Welcome, Raelene, really excited to have you here. So as we begin, let's acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands where we are. You might like to hold in mind or even put in the chat if you know the name of the traditional owners of your country. For me here, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous people that have joined us today. At Meaningful Aging Australia, we also like to pay due respect to the incredible spiritual strength of Australia's First Peoples. So identity, it's such a tricky topic. It seems quite abstract and hard to get a handle on, and yet it is absolutely core to the Australian aged care quality standards. Meaningful Aging Australia and Raelene, Professor Yvonne Wells from La Trobe Uni, and also the team from NARI have been talking over several years about this tricky concept, and we've been keen to do some work to help you in the aged care sector with how to really work in quite a sophisticated way with this question of identity, because the last thing anyone needs is to be reduced to a bunch of tick boxes, which unfortunately tends to happen. Understandable. You know, we know that you're busy, we know the resources are very stretched, and we know that a lot of people haven't done any professional development around identity and how to work with that with people and how to understand it. So Raelene is an expert in this area and very keen to make a positive contribution. Her research interests also include technology, social connections and migration. She's done a lot of work with older people as well as younger people. But today, obviously, we're really focusing on older people, those that are accessing community and residential aged care services. So Raelene, I won't take up too much more time. We'll hand over to you. And then after Raelene's shared a bit with us, we'll have a chance for a bit of a discussion, but we will finish right on the half hour. Many of you would be familiar with my fairly strict timekeeping rules. So thank you for setting aside this half hour with us today. So over to you, Raelene.
Sorry, I just had to find a way to unmute myself then. Thank you, Ilse. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm living and working on Wurundjeri land, unceded Wurundjeri land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm hoping you can see that slide okay. And I really appreciate everyone's interest in today's topic. I suspect a lot of this interest comes from the fact that the aged care quality standards have brought a new focus onto the issue of identity. And it's clear that identity is something that needs to be maintained and valued in older age and in care contexts. But what's not quite so clear is exactly what this means or how it might be achieved. So I think the
You've just gone on to mute. Oh, no, now you're back off.
Am I unmuted again?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Thank you. So yes, I think the standards have raised as many questions as they have suggestions and solutions. So I'm going to assume that you're all pretty familiar with the quality standards that reflect an identity and the ways in which the resources express those requirements. But my aim here today is not so much to talk through what those standards are and to reiterate that for you, but rather to share with you some of the ways that social scientists such as me, and I'm a sociologist, how we think about identity. And I'm going to do this as a way of exploring what these standards are actually requiring, but also as a way of helping us to understand and acknowledge that some of the problems that are going to necessarily emerge in any attempts to implement identity in accordance with the standards comes from the fact that this is an incredibly complex concept. So if people are experiencing challenges with implementing this part of the standards, it's likely to be the result of that complexity. So what I want to try and do today is just to tease out some of that complexity and try and make sense of, or try and provide some frameworks for thinking through what identity is and how we might reflect on it and think with identity rather than just assume we know what it is. So what is identity? Well, we all know that we have an identity or identities, and it's highly likely that we all have a different understanding of our own identities and of what identity means or what our identity is. So let's start by acknowledging that there is no one single definition of identity. There's nothing that we can turn to that captures all of the relevant parts. We need to acknowledge that identity is also a contested term. So there's no agreement even amongst sociologists about what identity means. We also need to acknowledge that any understanding of identity has to take into account multiple dimensions, that identity is always changing across contexts, and that our identities are constantly changing and fluid. So identity, I'm hoping you're already getting the impression, identity is not something that I can explain to you in 15, 20 minutes, or that we'll be able to resolve by the end of this half hour. So I'm not even going to try to do that. What I will do in my short time here today is to try to explore some of what I see as the fundamentals of identity, and to try and give some thought to what those fundamentals mean for the aged care standards and for how we work with those standards. So I would start by arguing that any person's identity is constructed in the interaction between two key dimensions: our internal or inner sense of who we are, and the external categories and roles that are used to define us. So while it's helpful to try and think of these two as separate, we can't lose sight of the fact that they're always interacting with each other and they're always shaping each other. So the internal part of our identity is that sense of self that we hold within our minds and our bodies. It's the accumulation of all of our interactions with other people and with the world at large. It's defined by what we feel and what we know, and it's captured in our biography or our narrative, and in what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu refers to as our habitus, or our way of being in the world. The external part of our identity is captured in the ways that our social worlds value us, the way in which they count us. And I notice that there's a census coming up again soon, so that's one of the ways in which identities are made sense of, and the ways in which our social worlds categorize us. So this part of our identity is expressed every time we fill in a form or take on a new responsibility, or we're perceived or recognized by another person as fitting what they see as the criteria of a particular category. Importantly, this external part of our identity is largely outside of our control. It's something that is imposed upon us rather than something that we actively create. Whereas our internal sense of identity, we might feel that we have a stronger sense of control over. But I'm actually going to challenge that a little bit as we carry on today. So the external part of our identity is reflective of the world we were born into and that we live our lives in on an everyday basis. It's something that's sort of external to us. This external part of our identity is visible in the shared social and cultural maps that we use to navigate our lives. And I'm using the word maps today because I find it quite a useful metaphor, but there are other terms that are used in the literature, such as models or navigating particular networks and so on. I like maps for the purposes of today. So these shared maps that we use to navigate our lives have advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, it means we don't have to ask everything about another person every time we meet them, or ask everything about a context every time we encounter it, because we use these maps to attribute certain expectations to each person we meet based on the way they look, the way they behave, and how that appearance and behavior fits with our shared unconscious map of how the world works. On the minus side, this can mean that we bring assumptions to our encounters and our interactions with other people that are not always correct. And just to help illustrate what I mean, we can think about this in terms of the unconscious maps about age and about technology that often result in false assumptions about an older person's capacities in new technologies. So, for example, one of the things that's emerged in my research on new technologies and older adults is the presence of two very strong cultural maps that support ageist attitudes regarding older adults and technologies. On the one hand, there are these very strong maps that identify older people as conservative, unwilling, or unable to learn new things, as slow and as passive. And on the other hand, this map about the identities of older people clashes with another map that identifies new technologies as dynamic, active, fast-paced, and so on. Any encounter between older adults and new technologies is always shaped by the expectations embedded in these social and cultural maps. And what this means is that people working with older people assume that older adults are not able to use new technologies, and older people themselves internalize those assumptions because those maps are part of their shared world as well. And often people don't stop and question, well, is that actually true? Or is there perhaps another side to this story? Now, it is important to recognize that these social and cultural maps are not determining. They're not fixed and they're not always completely shared. And I've got these images of the early maps of Australia to help to illustrate that. So in fact, I do the work I do because I disagree with the assumptions embedded in those dominant maps of older people and technologies. My experience and my background tell me that many older adults actually have a strong interest in using new technologies. What they lack is opportunities to learn at their own pace and in their own ways. So the external identity maps that we carry around with us vary from person to person, depending on experiences, background, knowledge, and dispositions. It's also important to note that these maps change over time. They're constantly being revised in response to new knowledge becoming available and commonly available, or to new concerns being given priority within the broader community. And I think we can see this in recent years with the gradual normalization of gender and sexual diversity, and in the shifts over time in the gender roles and norms that now allow women to work and to vote and to own property, which wasn't the case 150 years ago, and for men to become more emotionally involved parents, which was also not necessarily the case 70 or 80 years ago. So why am I reflecting on these external maps as a part of identity? Why am I not just focusing on what matters to people in terms of their inner sense of identity and self? Well, as I said before, these two parts of identity, the external and the internal, constantly shape and inform each other. And I tend to agree with those social scientists who suggest that our inner sense of identity is shaped in large part by the external identity maps that our history, our society, and our culture have created for us. And anthropologist Liebe Fayer captures this in the word encounter. She argues that every time we meet a person or interact with a person, we bring with us our larger external maps of how the world works. And these larger external maps position us in colonial histories of race, in patriarchal histories of gender norms, and in the social structures of capitalism and globalization and so on. So our maps of our identities come into contact with each other in each encounter with another person or even with our material world. But they don't come into contact in an equal way. Instead, there are power dynamics at play, and these shape each interaction and encounter and determine whose version of identity is taken as normal and acceptable and whose version of identity has to change in order to fit with those norms and become acceptable. And I hope now the image of the flat earth as opposed to the globe is now starting to make sense to you as being different versions of the world that have assumed priority at different moments in historical time, depending on power dynamics. It wasn't enough to simply have the science. So what does all of this mean for aged care standards? Well, I would suggest that in order to value a person's identity in aged care, it's first necessary to acknowledge the power dynamic at play. Consider, for example, a person who is first receiving care. It's likely that they are presenting for care because they have experienced a significant biographical disruption, something that means they can no longer live in the way they were living. The changes in their life that require them to seek care will also be requiring them to navigate a change to their sense of self, their inner identity. And what this means is that their internal identity and their identity maps are already most likely fragile and vulnerable. The ways in which care is measured and funded means that that internal identity map is made even more fragile and vulnerable. Instead of being a valued independent member of the community, they have to present themselves as vulnerable, as dependent, and as requiring assistance in order to get access to care. The funding framework is focused on meeting the particular care needs of that person, such as feeding, washing, and medication. But in the process, what that framework does is also redefine that person's identity. It turns them into a care recipient, a person at risk, a person whose body is frail or disobedient. Now, the problem with that is that this new identity puts that person at risk of losing all of their previous identities. It puts them at risk of limiting their sense of self to being a body that requires care. Their identity is at risk of being reduced to something as simple as whether they're an easy body to care for or a difficult body to look after. And I think this is precisely the negative outcome that the standards are trying to avoid. However, I do recognise that this requires more than simple goodwill and awareness. It also actually requires resources that allow for the care workforce to engage with a person as a person rather than simply as a body to be cared for. At the same time, it's necessary to recognise that the care workforce and their managers have significant power over how the people in their care are perceived, and even over how the people in their care perceive themselves as a result of the imposition of external identity maps. So it's important to identify the practices that reinforce particular maps or versions of identity and the ones that contribute to the erasing of other possibilities. Now, I believe there are steps that can be taken to reduce the power dynamic and to expand the identities available to people receiving aged care. One important strategy is to make sure there is an opportunity to engage with a person's entire biography rather than just their current care needs. This helps to acknowledge that a person is not just a body to be cared for, but a person with a range of dimensions to their sense of self, some of which are more important on some days and others of which are more important on other days. That is, it's not actually enough to provide a once-off ticker box form that captures a person's identity. That would be inadequate because identity is necessarily fluid and changeable. It shifts in response to context, mood, capacity, opportunity, and experience. So this engagement actually has to happen on an ongoing basis. Another important strategy is to help create bridges for a person with the people, the things, the events, the practices, the habits and preferences that mattered to them before the biographical disruption that led to them requiring care. This is not to say that everything from their past life needs to be reproduced and made available in that current moment. Rather, it's about helping to create continuity across the break between their past sense of self and their new sense of self that's undergoing construction within the care environment, because they are generating a new identity in that space. And this requires an ongoing conversation about what the person would like to do today, what's important to them right now, and what they're looking forward to in the future. Also important, I would suggest, is being open to change in a person's preferences and identities and finding ways of validating that change. And in fact, I would go even further than this, and this is coming out again of my research in technology and aged care. I'd say it's actually important to create opportunities for change in a person's identity, whether that's by introducing them to a new activity or opening them up to a new type of food or helping them to meet new people or some other strategy. An identity that remains static, I would argue, and unchanging, it's not a full, robust and complete identity. So in conclusion, I'm fully aware that identity is a complex concept. I think the emphasis on identity in the standards leads to many more questions than solutions, but I don't necessarily see this as problematic. In fact, I do see it as an opportunity. I'd like to think that a greater awareness of the social, cultural and historical nature of our identities and of the power dynamics at play in our interactions might give us more opportunities to encounter each other in more respectful ways. However, how we endeavour to achieve that within the constraints of the current aged care funding model is a huge question. It's one that I'm keen to continue researching and exploring, so I hope that if this is a problem that you're also interested in, we can find ways of collaborating to develop new solutions that are practical, that are ethical and effective. Thank you for listening. I'm really interested to hear your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raelene. We'll turn off the recording now.